Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I'm Mike, a guy who's always found peace in nature. Born and raised in California, I've camped in remote spots all over the state, from the rugged cliffs along the coast to the quiet valleys tucked deep in the Sierra Nevadas. Nature has always been my refuge from the noise of the world. But sometimes the wilderness isn't as peaceful as it seems. This story is about one trip that changed how I see the outdoors, and how I'll never look at a quiet campsite the same way again. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. I'd chosen a quiet spot near the Mendocino National Forest, far from the busy tourist campsites and crowded trails. It was the perfect place to disconnect from everything and just be alone. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my RV by the edge of a thick forest, and settled in. The sun dipped behind the trees as I got a fire going. I didn't feel any need to rush, just enjoyed the solitude, made some dinner, and kicked back by the campfire. The silence of the place was almost surreal, just the flicker of the flames and the occasional sound of a critter moving in the underbrush. It was exactly what I needed. As evening turned into night, the temperature dropped, and I started to feel that familiar isolation settling in. I could hear the wind through the trees, the crackling of the fire. Everything felt still, like the entire forest was holding its breath. Around 8:30, I realized I was running low on firewood. I'd have to go out and gather some more if I wanted to keep the fire going until morning. The campsite was isolated. No neighbors, no stores nearby, and I knew if I didn't get enough wood now, I'd be left in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the night air biting at my skin. The world outside the RV was pitch black, except for the beam of my light, slicing through the darkness. I could barely make out the outlines of the trees ahead of me, just dark shadows against the inky sky. I made my way toward the small patch of woods where I knew I could find some fallen branches. My boots crunched on the gravel, and the rustle of leaves was the only other sound. There was something unsettling about the quiet. No animals, no sounds of distant hikers or cars, just me and the wilderness. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my eye, movement among the bushes. I stopped dead in my tracks, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe a deer? But no. This was something else. I squinted through the darkness and saw a figure. A man, crouched low behind some thick brush, barely visible but clearly there. He wasn't moving much, just holding still. His silhouette was all wrong. I felt my stomach knot. I hadn't seen another soul for miles, and there was no reason for anyone to be here. Not at this hour, not in this remote spot. I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly as I pointed it in his direction. I didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to alert him to my presence. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was another camper, a hiker who had gotten lost. But something told me this was no ordinary camper. There was a weirdness to his stillness, an unnerving intensity that made the blood in my veins turn cold. I cleared my throat, trying to mask my nervousness. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You okay over there?" Nothing. I waited a beat, then called out again, louder this time. "Hey, you need help?" Still no response. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves. I took a few steps forward, cautiously. The beam of the flashlight shook as I inched closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. The man didn't move, but I could feel the tension growing. There was something off about him. Something dangerous. I didn't know why I thought that, but my gut was telling me to leave. Another step, another beat of silence. "Are you lost?" I asked, the words trembling out of me. Still nothing. My pulse quickened. I should have turned around and walked away, but something in me refused to leave without knowing. Maybe he was just some guy who had wandered too far off the trail. Maybe I was overthinking it. But then, just as I took another step closer, I saw it. His eyes. They flashed from behind the bushes, cold and unblinking, locking onto mine. I froze. My chest tightened. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The air felt thicker, heavier. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Then, in a blink, he moved. It wasn't a simple stand-up. He dropped to all fours, crawling like a wild animal. His hands scraped across the dirt as he shot forward, faster than I could have imagined. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. My boots pounded the gravel beneath me, my heart thundering in my chest. The adrenaline surged, making my legs burn. I barely even heard the sound of him moving behind me. It was like everything else had been drowned out by the panic in my head. I reached the RV in seconds. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, but I finally got the door open and slammed it shut behind me. I locked it in one quick motion, my fingers still trembling. My breath came in gasps as I pressed my back to the door, listening. The minutes felt like hours. I didn't dare look out the windows. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe too loudly. Every small sound outside sent my heart racing. Was he out there? Was he just waiting, watching me? The wind howled and branches scraped against the side of the RV. I felt the weight of the silence pressing in on me, suffocating. I stayed huddled in the corner, eyes fixed on the door, too afraid to even look through the blinds. But then, after what felt like an eternity, I finally mustered the courage to peek. My hand trembled as I drew the blinds just enough to get a glimpse of the outside. It was dark, the woods were still. There was no sign of him, no movement, no figure in the shadows. I exhaled, but the relief didn't last long. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere, just waiting for the right moment to make his move. That night, I hardly slept. Every noise outside made my skin crawl. The wind, the branches scraping the sides of the RV, it all felt too loud, too close. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care about the firewood anymore. I didn't care about finishing the trip. I just needed to get out. I kept checking the rearview mirror as I drove down the winding road, half expecting to see him running after me. But there was nothing. The road was empty, the trees still. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the way he ran toward me on all fours, the way he moved with that speed, that unnatural hunger. It wasn't human. My name's Jack, and I've always been the type of person who enjoys getting away from the chaos of everyday life. I work in tech, and when things get too overwhelming, I pack up my RV and drive out into the California wilderness to clear my head. No cell service, no internet, just me and the open road. I've done it a dozen times, and every come back feeling more grounded. But one trip, one night in particular, changed everything. It was supposed to be a quiet solo trip. I found a campsite tucked away in the hills near Mendocino, a place where you can barely see another soul for miles. I'd parked my RV by the edge of a quiet wooded area. The sun had just set, and the trees were casting long, dark shadows over the dirt path. I made myself a simple dinner, lit a fire outside, and sat by the flames, just enjoying the silence. At first, the night felt peaceful. Maybe even too peaceful. The forest had a strange stillness to it, like it was holding its breath. But that all changed when I noticed the man outside. It was about 9:30 p.m. The sky had gone completely dark, and the only light around me was from the fire. I was sitting inside the RV, finishing up a cup of coffee and scrolling through my phone, not expecting anything unusual to happen. Then I saw movement outside. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or some other animal, but when I looked up, I froze. A man in a dirty hoodie was pacing back and forth outside my RV. His movements were jerky and erratic, almost like he didn't know where he was going, just wandering in circles. He was staring at me through the window, but I couldn't see his face clearly, just the silhouette of his figure in the dim light. His hoodie was pulled low over his head, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't doing anything but pacing, back and forth, never taking his eyes off the window. I felt an immediate sense of dread. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew something wasn't right. Why would anyone be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? It didn't make sense. I sat still, hoping he wouldn't notice that I had seen him. Maybe he was just a lost hiker? But then I remembered that I hadn't passed anyone on the way in, and the nearest campground was miles away. I grabbed my phone, heart racing, and tried to dial the ranger station, but there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere. There was no one to help if things went south. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was overthinking it, but the man's strange behavior kept gnawing at me. He hadn't made any sound, not a single word or step, just pacing. I decided to do what any rational person would do. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the RV door just a crack, enough to peek outside. The man was still there, but now he had stopped pacing. He was standing completely still staring in my direction. His face was still hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel his eyes on me. It felt like he was watching me, not just looking at me, but watching, like he was waiting for something. His presence felt wrong, like he wasn't supposed to be there. I slammed the door shut and locked it immediately, my breath coming faster now. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call out, ask if he needed help. But another part of me, the part that felt like something wasn't right, told me to stay quiet and stay inside. Minutes passed. Then the pacing started again. I kept an eye on him through the small window by the kitchen. He was still moving in those strange, jerky steps, like he was stuck in some kind of loop. Back and forth, back and forth. Each time he passed the window, his head would tilt just slightly as if he was trying to get a better look inside, his eyes never leaving me. I don't know how long it went on, maybe an hour, maybe longer. It felt like an eternity. The quiet of the forest, the flickering of the fire outside, and the strange man walking back and forth, it all felt suffocating. I could hardly think. I didn't want to move. I didn't want him to know I was still awake, still watching him. At one point, he stopped pacing entirely and just stood still, staring at the window. I could feel his presence even though I couldn't see his face. The silence was unbearable. The stillness in the air was suffocating. I didn't know what he wanted. I didn't know why he was here. But I felt something in my gut telling me that I had to do something. But what? I couldn't just sit there forever. The night was getting colder, and I had to decide whether to call for help, risk going outside, or just wait it out. After what felt like forever, I finally decided I needed to confront the situation. I grabbed my keys and the flashlight again and slowly unlocked the door. But before I could open it, I heard a sound. His voice, low and muffled like he was talking to himself. I couldn't make out the words. But the tone, it was disturbing. It wasn't just talking. It was like he was arguing with someone. But there was no one there. Just me. I stood frozen, my hand still on the doorknob. His voice continued, rising in volume, but still incoherent. It was like he was having a conversation with ghosts or something in his head that I couldn't understand. My legs felt like lead. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to lock the door and forget the whole thing. But then suddenly he stopped. The silence returned. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, closer. I held my breath, waiting. And that's when it happened. Out of nowhere, he started banging on the door, hard. Bam! 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 The sound rattled the RV. I almost jumped out of my skin. "Let me in," he yelled, his voice sounding crazed, high-pitched, and wild. The words were slurred, like he couldn't even form a sentence, but I could tell he was angry, terrifyingly angry. "Let me in," He screamed again, this time with more force. His voice sounded guttural, almost animalistic. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. I was frozen, unable to move. My mind was racing. Why is he doing this? What does he want? The banging continued, each hit making the whole RV shake. I could hear his breath, ragged and frantic, like he was losing control. His voice turned into more garbled yelling, random words that didn't make sense, a language that didn't feel human. I didn't know how long this went on, but it felt like hours. In reality, it was probably only a few minutes, but to me, it felt like an eternity. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go outside. He'd seen me. I couldn't call for help. There was no service out here. He kept banging on the door, the sound growing more and more frantic, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Complete silence. I don't know how long I sat there, not daring to move, too terrified to even breathe. Eventually, I mustered the courage to peek out through the small window again. But there was no sign of him. No man. Nothing. But the fear that never left. I don't know what happened that night or who that man was. He never came back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere in the dark. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terror, and when the sun finally came up, I packed up and left without a second thought. I never went back to that campsite, never camped alone again, and every time I think about it, I can still hear that banging on the door. I've always been the type of person who enjoys solitude. I love being alone in nature. It helps clear my head, and there's just something peaceful about being surrounded by the quiet of the woods. A few months ago, I decided to take a solo trip to an RV park in Northern California. It was a small, quiet place tucked away in the woods, far enough from civilization that I wouldn't be disturbed. I'd been there before, so I knew the area pretty well. I arrived in the afternoon, set up my RV, and figured I'd go for a hike on one of the trails nearby. There were a few trails to choose from, but I decided on a longer, less traveled one. The sun was still up, and it was the perfect time for a peaceful walk. There were only a few people staying at the park, so I didn't expect anyone else to be on the trail. It was just going to be me, the trees, and the sound of my boots on the dirt path. The trail was just as beautiful as I remembered. It wound through thick trees, the path narrow and uneven in places, but nothing I couldn't handle. I felt good, calm, and at peace. For the first hour or so, I didn't see or hear anyone. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call. I was moving at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude, when I first noticed something odd. I started hearing footsteps behind me. At first, I thought maybe I was just imagining things, or that someone had caught up with me on the trail. But when I stopped to listen, I could hear them too clearly to be my own. The steps were light, but deliberate. Someone was walking behind me at the same pace. Not too fast, not too slow. I figured it was probably another hiker. Maybe someone who had started the trail behind me, or someone who had taken a different path and was now catching up. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I kept walking, I started to feel like I wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I was used to. It felt off. I decided to test it. I slowed down for a few moments, letting the person behind me catch up. But when I stopped, the footsteps didn't stop. They kept going at the same pace. That's when I started to get uneasy. Whoever it was wasn't just walking along the trail. They were following me. I kept walking, but now I was listening more carefully, my senses heightened. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just another hiker, maybe someone out for a walk just like me. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Why was this person keeping so close? Why weren't they passing me? I glanced over my shoulder once, but there was no one there. The trail was empty, but I could still hear the footsteps. Now I knew something wasn't right. I picked up the pace, trying to stay calm, Maybe they were just behind me, I thought. Maybe I was overthinking it. But the footsteps didn't speed up to match my pace. Instead, they stayed steady, never getting closer or farther away. It was almost like they were keeping the same distance from me on purpose. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. I started to feel a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I couldn't see anyone, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. It felt like the air was thicker, heavier. Every rustling of leaves, every crack of a twig underfoot made my heart jump. I decided I needed to stop and assess the situation. I turned off the main trail for a moment and took a seat on a large rock. I told myself that maybe I was just being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The woods can do that to you, make you feel like someone's lurking around every corner. But then I heard it again, the footsteps. Closer now, like the person had followed me off the main path and was standing just behind the trees, waiting. I stood up quickly and started walking again, faster this time. I didn't want to run, not yet. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if something was truly wrong. But as I kept walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was behind me was waiting for me to make a move. And the thought of someone just lurking out there, following me through the woods, made my stomach twist. I couldn't take it anymore. I broke into a jog, trying to move faster without drawing attention. But the footsteps followed. I could hear them behind me, getting closer, almost like they were matching my pace. They weren't just following me. They were deliberately staying close. That's when panic hit. I turned around, half expecting to see a fellow hiker or someone who'd just been walking behind me, but there was nothing. The trail was empty. My breath came in short, fast bursts, and for a split second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. But then I heard it again. The footsteps, only now, they were closer, a little too close. Whoever it was had been behind me the whole time. I didn't stop to think. I took off running. My legs burned, and my heart pounded in my chest as I bolted down the trail. The sound of boots pounding against the dirt was right behind me, and I could hear the heavy breathing getting closer. Whoever was following me wasn't just walking anymore. They were running. I risked another glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw him. A man. Tall, with a scruffy face and ragged clothes. His eyes were wide, and his lips were curled into an unsettling grin. He wasn't running like a normal person. He was stalking me, his steps calculated and methodical. And in his hand he held a hunting knife, the blade glinting in the fading sunlight. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. My mind was screaming at me to get back to the RV park, to get out of those woods, but the man was gaining on me. I kept running, the trail never seeming to end. I wasn't sure how far I was from the park, but it felt like miles. I didn't dare stop. My body ached, my lungs burned, but I couldn't afford to slow down. Finally, I saw the trees start to thin, and in the distance, I saw the lights of the park. I pushed harder, faster. I could hear the man's footsteps behind me, closer now, but I was almost there. I crossed the threshold of the park and screamed for help. The people at the RV park heard me and rushed to help. I was out of breath, my body shaking, and the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. Someone called the police immediately while others tried to calm me down, but I could barely form words. The police arrived shortly after and began searching the woods without delay. They combed through the area, looking for any trace of the man, but came up empty-handed. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They promised to keep looking, but the doubt on their faces told me they weren't hopeful. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't run, if I hadn't managed to make it back to the park. Now, I'm always careful when I go hiking, and I'll never go alone in such isolated places again. I don't know what we were thinking. Looking back, It feels like the dumbest idea ever, but at the time, it seemed like a fun way to kill time. My friends and I were camping near the woods in California, in an RV park that was tucked away from the main road. The air was crisp, and the stars were so bright you could see every little detail of the landscape. It was the kind of peaceful night where you could hear the faint rustling of trees, and maybe, just maybe, your mind would start to play tricks on you. It was a Saturday night. We were 3 hours into setting up, making s'mores, and just chilling by the fire when someone, probably Danny, he was always the one with the wild ideas, suggested playing hide and seek in the dark. It didn't help that we were all a little drunk from the beer we'd been passing around. We were being loud and stupid and didn't care much about anything else. "We should do it. It'll be like super scary," Danny said, grinning like he was already proud of his genius idea. I wasn't so sure. I mean, the woods were right there, and it was pitch black by now. The kind of darkness that makes you feel like something's watching you, even though you know nothing is really there. But still, I thought, what could go wrong? It's just a game. It was me, Danny, his girlfriend Sarah, and our friend Luke who were playing. We were all in our early 20s, and we thought we were invincible. After a few minutes of agreeing on the rules, we split up into 2 groups, and I got picked to be the seeker. It was Danny's idea to do it like this. One person hides, and the seeker has to find them, but you're allowed to move around the area in total darkness. No flashlights, just the sound of crunching leaves beneath your feet and the occasional snap of a twig. It was supposed to be fun, like a horror movie, but real life. The game started off like any other hide and seek. We scattered off in different directions, laughing and trying to get away from the seeker, but something about the woods felt off. It's hard to explain, but it was like the trees were closing in on us, like the whole forest had become part of the game. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew no one was near me. I remember hearing Sarah's voice in the distance, calling out for Luke, and then the sound of someone running. It was just the kind of creepy sound that makes your stomach drop, but I didn't want to let myself get spooked, so I just kept walking. The game went on for a while. I found Sarah hiding behind a rock after maybe 20 minutes, but then, well, that's when things started to get weird. Luke was the last person I needed to find, and I could tell he was close because I could hear his footsteps in the dirt. But when I called his name, I didn't hear a response. It didn't feel right. Luke was never quiet during a game like this, and we'd always mess with each other, even if we were trying to be stealthy. So when I called out again and got nothing in return, I felt a little uneasy, but I figured he was just hiding well. I searched for him for what felt like hours, calling his name, stomping around in the dark. At first, it seemed like a game, but after a while, I began to realize that something was wrong. I went back to where we'd set up camp, thinking maybe Luke had just wandered off and was waiting for us to finish the game so he could come back. But when I got back, Danny and Sarah were sitting by the fire, both looking confused and a little nervous. "Where's Luke?" I asked. "I thought he was with you," Sarah said, her voice shaky. I was starting to feel panic crawl up my chest. "No, I haven't seen him in ages. I've been searching for him." We all went back into the woods together, calling out his name, but there was no sign of him. No movement. Nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. We checked every inch of that forest, even near the river, but nothing. At this point, I was scared. We kept yelling, our voices echoing in the woods, but it felt like the trees were swallowing the sound. I had this horrible feeling that we weren't looking for Luke anymore. We were looking for a body. As the night wore on and the temperature dropped, I started to lose hope. We had walked miles, searching in every direction, calling his name until my throat was raw. Then Danny suggested we check near the edge of the woods, near the old dirt road that led to the RV park's entrance. We'd all joked about how creepy that area was, but at this point, I didn't care. I wanted to find him. I needed to know he was okay. We made our way toward the road, the ground uneven and slippery in places. The forest here was dense, but as we got closer to the clearing, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I stopped. My heart started pounding. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. We all stood still. It was quiet for a moment, and then we heard something. Footsteps. Someone was running. Not from behind us, but from up ahead, just on the edge of the trees. It was fast, like whoever it was didn't want to be caught. We froze, listening. Then, in a flash, we all turned and bolted toward the sound. As we ran, I could barely see in front of me, but I knew we were getting closer. We were almost to the clearing when I saw it, a shape tied to a tree near the edge of the woods. It was Luke. I can't even describe the feeling that hit me when I saw him. He was standing there, his arms bound behind him with some kind of rough rope, his clothes ripped up, his face pale and covered in dirt. His eyes were wide with terror, and when he saw us, he started to shake, like he'd been through hell. And then, just as I started running toward him, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A man. He was running in the opposite direction, deeper into the woods. He wasn't looking at us, he was looking at the ground, almost like he was trying to avoid being seen. "Who the hell is that?" Danny shouted. We didn't wait for an answer. We rushed over to Luke, untied him as fast as we could, and helped him to his feet. He was trembling, barely able to stand. When we asked him what happened, all he could say was, "There was someone. He was watching me. I don't know what he wanted, but he wouldn't let me go." We never saw the man again. We never spoke about it after that night. We packed up the RV, left the camp, and went back to the city as quickly as we could. But every time I think about that night, I get this cold feeling that maybe Luke wasn't the only one out there in the woods. Sometimes I wonder who that man was and why he was out there. Was he waiting for us? Was he hunting for someone? And why the hell was Luke tied up like that? The whole thing still haunts me, even though we never reported it to the police. It felt like the kind of thing no one would believe. But I know what I saw, and I know what Luke went through. And every time I hear someone suggest playing hide and seek in the dark, I can't help but think, maybe some games are better left unplayed. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.